Today we're going to go over some of the most common misconceptions in reptiles that I hear. I'm going to put this kind of in an order that starts with some beginner knowledge all the way up to a little more advanced. I wouldn't say it's massively advanced, but there are breeders that I know that didn't really consider that my last point is true. They didn't really know. At number one would be that this is a beginner snake. I made a whole video about this. I don't think that any animal, especially ones that are called beginner animals, should be approached in that regard. Do I think that the ball python is a relatively easy animal? In the grand scheme of things, yes. It is pretty simple compared to many other animals, but that's the thing, compared to many other animals. It doesn't mean that it's a cakewalk. These animals will sometimes just give you issues feeding just because they had a slightly bad experience one time. You get different personalities with them, where some will be great eaters, some will just give you trouble all the time and take forever to start eating. They'll eat one time, go off for another 4 weeks. I wouldn't call that easy. In fact, it's quite stressful. Most of my follow-up questions when I sell an animal to somebody are, oh my god, it's not eating, what do I do? There are some care requirements. You need to provide a heat source for them. You need to regulate that heat source so that it does not burn them and possibly burn your home down. You need to provide hides. You need to provide the proper substrate that can retain at least a bit of humidity, and then that's the other thing, you need to provide a basic level of humidity for them as well, amongst many other things which I cover in my video. Are they a easy snake to start with as your first snake? Sure, if you want to technically title that as a beginner snake. I'm just not really into the terminology there because it makes it sound like you can throw this thing in a box or in a fish tank and call it a day. You cannot do that. You will end up with a very dead animal or sick animal, even though it will tolerate it for a bit of time. Number two that I hear all the time at shows, I don't think there's a single show that goes by that I don't hear it, and it's that they are slimy. Whenever somebody touches their first snake, they're freaked out, they go to touch it, and then they start petting it, maybe they hold it, and they're like, this isn't at all what I thought. I hear a lot of times that they didn't know what they expected, but they didn't expect it to be so smooth, and then I also hear, I thought it would be slimy. No, they're not slimy, they're smooth, they can be a little cool to the touch. It's a different kind of feeling. Even if you're afraid of snakes, I'd say challenge yourself to get over that fear just by maybe holding the tail end of the snake. I often do this with people who are still afraid. I'll hold the top end of the snake with the head here. Just let them maybe kind of mess around with the tail so that they can experience that without having any fear of the snake biting them, which it wasn't going to ever. The point of the matter here is that handling a snake is not at all how you think it would be if you've never done it, and they're most certainly not slimy. Now we'll occasionally start moving into a few things that could actually affect their health kind of drastically in some cases. And coming in at number three is that you need to move them into another enclosure or caging system to feed them. Otherwise, they're going to become cage aggressive. No. Not at all. You don't need to do that. In fact, if you do that, you can actually hurt their health. When you're moving them around from place to place, you're causing them stress. They are vulnerable when they're eating in the wild. They have to constrict the prey. More on that a little bit later, but it takes a bit of time, and then after they eat, they get this lump in their stomach which causes them to be a little bit slower, not as comfortable. In fact, often when disturbed too much after eating, they might regurgitate their food, which can cause a lot of very serious issues with your animal. When your snake regurgitates, it shouldn't eat for at least 2 weeks. That's to rebuild up its enzymes which help it digest. A snake is going to act how a snake is going to act. Its personality is going to dictate how it reacts when you're feeding and whatnot. Some snakes are pretty food aggressive. Most ball pythons are not. They usually just want you to leave them be so that they can eat. But I have a few, one in particular, who thinks he's a reticulated python because he loves food. But that's the thing. He's a sweetheart. If I go get him right now, he's not gonna mess with me. But if he smells the rat, then he changes. So yeah, certainly you should be on the lookout when you're feeding them. Make sure you're taking a little bit extra precaution because they don't see all that well, and they use their heat pits quite often to locate food. And when you are near the food, especially if you're dangling frozen thawed or however you're doing it, you shouldn't really do that. You should use tongs. Your heat source kind of blends together and it smells not from a direction. So it might get you. That's the most common place you do get bit. But they're not being cage aggressive when they're hungry. They're hungry. You're going to get that same reaction if you move them to the other bin as well, or you'll get no reaction, which is even worse because they're not going to eat because they're afraid now. They're stressed out. They just wanted to be left alone. Imagine if you were picked up and moved into a different home that was blank and devoid of all of your comforts, just a table and some giant handing you a piece of food. I don't think you'd be too comfortable, and neither are they. Leave them in their homes. They are perfectly comfortable to eat in there, and then they're going to become more accustomed to eating in there. Your snake is going to be what your snake is going to be. If it smells food and it likes food, count your lucky blessings that it eats and make sure that you're just a little bit more on guard during that. Number 4 would be that they don't have ears and they cannot hear. That's a pretty astute observation to make, because you're looking at this animal and you don't see ears, right? But they do hear and they do have ears. They just don't have an ear lobe. If you're making some noise around your animal, it's going to react. If you cover your ears and have someone else talk, or you hear yourself talk, that's what they kind of hear like. It's very muffled, but they can hear and they do have ears under there. They do use this sense enough that it can affect their sense of balance. People are now coming out with studies that spider gene that infamously causes the snake to wobble and corkscrew and it doesn't know up from down. It's not actually a neurological issue, so to speak, is what we're coming to believe anyways now. It's actually an inner ear issue. The severity can vary because some spiders don't show anything and some are absolutely out of this world wonky. And it's because they don't have a good sense of balance because of this. You might think, well, how can that affect your balance? But it can. That's why things like flashbangs exist. It disorientates you on several different senses. And when your senses are disorientated, you can become dizzy, you can become unbalanced. If you've ever had vertigo, you know what I'm talking about. I have, and it sucked. But this is what causes them to lose their sense of balance and not really know their up from down. Number 5, they dislocate their jaws to eat their food. This is not true, but it is, again, something that's been passed around forever, and it's another one that makes sense when you're looking at it. How can an animal that's mouth and head are so small eat a rodent that's about as thick as they are? I don't know about you, but I can't eat something that's as wide as I am. They can, and they do this not because they dislocate their jaw, it's because their jaw is much different from ours. They have a lot of cartilage in their jaw, which allows them to stretch quite a bit more than we can. But on top of that, what really sets it apart is that their jaw is not joined here like ours is. They, like predator or something, also can open their mouths a bit like this and stretch that skin like this. So now all of a sudden you've got this big old boxy opening. Their teeth are curved inwards and designed to walk the prey back into their stomachs. You can kind of see the split on the bottom of their jaw where this occurs. I've seen it before on like Facebook forum groups. They're like, oh my God, look at this line. Is he okay? Did he hurt himself? Did he get a scratch? No, it's completely natural. That's where they split their jaw. At number 6 is a funny one, and it's also kind of a sad one, but that would be that if you put your snake next to you, it is going to move up next to you to measure you to see if it can eat you. No snake is doing that because that's not what they do. They don't do that to their prey items. Why the heck would they do that to you? For one, there's no way that it could eat you. Only a retic could do it, and you would have to be a very small person. I believe that the other 4 or 5 people that have been historically eaten were well under 5 feet. Very small, and usually very elderly. Furthermore, if a snake were to eat you, we're not exactly designed well to be eaten. Our arms kind of get in the way. I believe in every instance where a retic had done this, again, in the history of mankind, they died. Not because someone killed them, but because their stomachs essentially burst. So they're not going to, and especially not a ball python, and they're certainly not measuring you to eat you. That's not what they would do. If they wanted to try to eat you, they would strike you and they would wrap you and constrict you. I've been bitten by my snake and then it constricted me because it thought it was a rodent. Frogs are more likely to attempt to eat you because they're stupid and they'll eat anything, but you're not going to be eaten by a snake and they're not measuring you. They do not have the intelligence to check you out to make sure that. In fact, quite often they can just take a look at an entity, so to speak, and determine whether they can eat it. Usually if I put a prey item that's even slightly too big for my ball pythons, they'll just run into the corner and hide from it. Even though they could probably eat it, they're certainly not going to eat you. It is absurd, and it's a little worrisome sometimes when I hear the sources of where people heard this. Sometimes it comes from highly respected people like medical professionals. There's no science to prove that they're measuring you. Probably one of the most absurd and agreed upon topics in reptiles and certainly in snakes. Number 7 is that they can be housed together. I guess that's not a myth. You can house them together, but they're not gonna do well. If you want a snake that's housed together, go get yourself some gardener snakes. Highly underrated, cool social little animals that love to be with their kind, but not ball pythons. Ball pythons love to be alone. They are introverts by nature. They enjoy their privacy, their space. The other problem with that is that they're gonna compete for resources. Even if you think you've provided enough for them, they really don't know that. If they're being chased out by another animal, they're gonna defend themselves, or they're gonna to just get stressed out, and they might not eat because of that. If they had to move, if they feel like there's another alpha in there, and they will set that up amongst themselves, especially if you get two males. In the wild, males will buck each other and hit each other. One of them can easily leave and nobody really ever gets hurt. They don't bite or try to strangle each other typically, but in captivity, where are they gonna go? The type of enclosure you would need to adequately even house them together is probably the same size of enclosure that you might need for a reticulated python, or more. A size of not the zoo enclosures that you see a ball python in, but that you see a like boa constrictor, something massive. And are you going to spend that much room and time and money to build such a thing? Because you're probably gonna have to build it yourself. And on top of all that, even if you do give the adequate space for two, maybe three of them to live together, you're still gonna need to make sure you don't have two males. If you don't want to breed them, you're gonna make sure you have two females, and they're still going to stress out about each other's appearance. They want to be left alone. In the amount of space that you could put two of them in the same enclosure, you could probably put 10. Maybe I'm a little over the top there, but you could put a lot of animals, especially if you're doing tubs. But even if you're doing tanks, you could still fit probably 3 or 4 tanks. Honestly, that's probably calling it very short. And I'm talking about 40-gallon tanks. At number 8 would be that you can tell their gender based on the size of their tail. While this is true to an extent with certain species like colubrids in some cases, king snakes and hognoses, even there it can fall short of being true. But in ball pythons, it is not a factor at all. The size of the snake, eventually as it grows up, will usually be an indicator because females are much bigger. But the size of the tail of the snake, it makes no difference. How you can tell is by popping or probing. And popping, we just recently showed off a brief amount of it. Maybe I'll do a full video on it. It's something that you need to be careful and you need to learn. Basically, you kind of pull back the skin on one side while gently rolling your thumb forward on the other side. And this causes the hemipenes, if it's a male, to invert and come out. And well, they only have those if they're a boy. But if you're not seeing anything, or if you maybe see just some white glands, you're probably looking at a female there. And the other option is to probe the animal. Again, something that you should be careful doing. I prefer to pop, but with probing, you need to essentially put your probe down into that area. And that's why it's very important you're careful, because you could rupture it. So as you're doing this, if it goes further, you've got a male on your hand. And that's because, again, those hemipenes were inverted. They go further down in. It won't go very far at all with a female though, because there's nothing for it to go into. So no, you can't tell it by its tail, but there are ways to tell it. And there is actually one other way. If you don't trust yourself to pop, if you don't trust yourself to probe, it will cost you $25 and a stamp to send it to RGI testing. And they'll do a sex test for you based on the shed of your animal. Now you'll have to wait a month, 2 months, but scientifically you will then prove what gender your animal is. That's the third way. I guess the safest, costs a little bit of money, takes a little bit of time, but if all you're getting is a pet and you kind of want to know, 25 bucks and a stamp ain't too bad. Number 9 would be that they don't climb. There's a lot of different thought topics on whether they can or if it's absolutely necessary, but they can climb. There's a video on Snake Discovery that they had an escapee ball python and climbed across a thin wire to get to the other side of their enclosures, and they found it and saw it on their security camera. So yeah, they can climb, and if you build an enclosure with stuff to climb, they will occasionally climb. Do they have to climb? Do they need to climb? Is there a such thing as enrichment that they get? Well, I'm not convinced on that one, but that's not really what I'm talking about on this point. Now, in their native area in Africa, there is a season where it can get a little bit of floods. Now, that's not to say it's like a pond, but their burrows flood out and the area can become a little bit more damp. During this time, they're not necessarily climbing trees. There's not very many instances of them being found in the wild in trees, but they will climb bushes. They have even been found with birds in their stomachs. While I would say that they're generally predispositioned to hide during the day, they love being in the dark, they're also incredibly adaptable animals. That's why they're such a good pet snake. You don't have to provide them the climbing spot though. Most people don't, but you can. And if you're just building one just for yourself as a pet, as long as you take care of the other requirements, by all means do it. I don't necessarily always recommend a fish tank. In fact, maybe we can show the thing I recommend. You can put some stuff in there for them to kind of mess around on, and they will use it, especially during night. They will come out a lot more. Number 10, as a breeder, this is really only concerning you. It's that they can only be paired during their breeding season where they come from naturally in Africa, which I always hear starting right around Halloween, a week before, maybe the week of Halloween. It gets a little cooler, the animals come out, they breed, and then they'll lay sometimes between May to September-ish, but that's nonsense. They can breed whenever. Are you telling me that they're fertile only during that time? I have had snakes that didn't lay their eggs until, well, Christmas time-ish. I am still doing pairing pairings right now. Generally, I do like to pair during that time. It's more of a habit at this point. Just a lot of people do it during then. It doesn't really matter though when you do it. They do seem to pair up a little bit better during the rain though. I have kind of noticed that. There are some tricks you can do to get them to pair up a little bit better, but I'd struggle to find one reason why that snake has a calendar in there and it's like looking at the time to see when they should be breeding. That's complete nonsense. And your house, if you're saying the temperature, shouldn't be open to the actual outside elements. So they're going to be feeling your air conditioning, your heating, and during winter, it's probably going to be actually hotter because your heat will be on. So that's not always going to be the case. Some breeders swear by a temperature drop helping during that time. I really don't see a difference, and I've tried it. They breed or they don't breed. It's as simple as that. The time of year is completely irrelevant. And one that I hear, even some breeders in the past, I have heard them say it, and it's a harmless misconception, but that would be that they kill their prey by suffocating them. Well, that can take quite some time. When a snake kills a rodent, it does not take very long in some cases at all. In fact, I've seen it happen in seconds. The rodent certainly is not running out of oxygen during that time. And while technically, yes, people who have strangled other people, they can pass out because of lack of blood flow to the brain, this is not what's happening either. What's actually happening is that the snake is constricting and doing it in such a way and making subtle adjustments every single time the rodent moves or exhales to cause the animal to go into cardiac arrest. It's basically causing a heart attack. That is how a constrictor actually kills. If it's killing by suffocation, it would take a lot longer and it would probably take a lot more bites and damages and scratches from its prey items. And if you feed live, you know that would be catastrophic. Even a dying rodent can inflict a mortal wound. So they are not suffocating them. They don't have that kind of time. The other thing that unfortunately it's a bit grisly to describe this quite often, as the snake wraps the rodent and constricts, within the first 10 seconds or so, the rodent starts to spit up blood. This is not because it's being strangled. Again, it's because they're causing a cardiac arrest. So I get it. It makes a lot of sense to assume that they're suffocating it. That's what we've heard for so long. These misconceptions, all of them that I've listed, really for the most part, have been around for a long time. So much to the point where nobody questions them. And who's going to? Nobody cares about fixing these things except for people like me. Sometimes they're harmless, but some of it isn't. And I like to educate people so that they can learn, because once they start to learn about these animals and learn what they are and what they actually do, how they actually act and behave, well, then that helps dispel probably the biggest misconception, which I haven't mentioned. And it's not gonna get a point because it's the whole point partially of me doing videos like this. And that's that snakes are dangerous or that they're evil. I've been far hurt more on accident by my cat, by my dog, than I have by any reptile ever. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you wanted to see our video on why I don't think that the ball python should be considered a beginner snake, you can check that out right here.